The record had been sitting in the Conclave archive for 300 years. Nobody read it anymore. There was no reason to. It was filed under a category that nobody liked to visit, extinct species, and it sat between two other dead civilizations that had died for reasons far less dramatic than a star gone wrong. Lyra found it by accident. She was a Vethani, which meant she had 4 eyes and the kind of patience that came from a species that lived for 200 years. She was also a diplomat, which meant she had learned to read things that were not interesting in the hope that they would eventually become useful. She had been writing a paper about civilizations that had disappeared without leaving wreckage, not destroyed by war, not eaten by plague, simply gone, and the human file had come up in her search results as a footnote. She almost skipped it. The entry was short. It said that a species called humans had existed on a planet called Earth in a system called Sol. It said they had been a Class II civilization, which meant they had faster-than-light travel, but had only used it a handful of times. It said that 302 years ago their star had entered a cascading fusion collapse, a rare event, brutal and total, and that the system had been declared uninhabitable within 6 years. Conclave survey teams had passed through what remained 40 years after the event. They found debris, rocks, silence. The file was stamped extinct and closed. What caught Lyra's attention was one line near the bottom. No evacuation wreckage recovered. She read it again. Then she set down her notes and thought about it for a long moment. Every other species in the extinct category had left something behind. Broken ships, abandoned stations, emergency beacons gone cold. Even civilizations that had not survived their own disasters had left evidence that they had tried. Humans had left nothing. The survey teams had found no bodies, no emergency pods, no half-finished escape vessels, just rocks and the memory of a star. Lyra wrote a small note to herself, then she moved on. She would think about that note 3 weeks later, when the alert came in. The sensor station at the edge of the old Sol exclusion zone was not a prestigious posting. The Conclave maintained it mostly out of habit, a bureaucratic leftover from the days when the exclusion zone had been formally active, before everyone agreed there was nothing left to exclude. The 2 technicians who staffed it spent most of their time reading, playing long games against each other, and filing automated reports that nobody read. The report they filed on the 44th day of the 7th rotation was not automated. They had picked up a gravitational signature from deep space, specifically from a region of space between the old Sol boundary and the outer dark where no mapped objects existed. The signature was wrong. Not wrong like a glitch or a sensor error. Wrong like something that should not be there was there. The mass reading was enormous, but it was not the smooth, constant pull of a rogue planet or a drifting dark object. It flickered. It shifted. It had gaps in it like light through fingers. The technicians flagged it priority 2 and sent it up the chain. It sat in a queue for 11 days before someone senior enough to be bothered looked at it, and then it jumped very quickly to priority 1. The Conclave sent 3 scout ships, a Vethani vessel, a Dreven patrol cruiser, and a small scientific ship from a species called the Orani, who were very good at sensor analysis and very bad at being surprised. All 3 ships arrived in the region of the anomaly within a day of each other. All 3 began their scans. What they found made the Orani science team go completely quiet, which was extremely unusual. The anomaly was not a natural object. It was a fleet. Not a fleet in the sense of a military formation, though it was organized with a precision that suggested someone had thought about it very carefully for a very long time. It was a fleet in the sense of a city that had learned to move. There were thousands of ships, running so close together that at long range they blurred into a single mass on the sensors. Some were enormous, genuine Ark-class vessels that dwarfed anything the Conclave scouts had seen outside of Conclave shipyards. Some were small, fast, clearly designed for rapid response. Between them ran a web of docking connections, fuel lines, transit cables. It was not a convoy. It was a civilization that had taken its infrastructure with it when it left. All three scouts sent their data back to the conclave immediately. Then they held position at a cautious distance and waited. The Vethani captain tried a hailing signal, standard conclave greeting protocols broadcast on 17 frequencies. She sent it once, then waited, then sent it again. She was composing her third attempt when the response came back. It came back on a frequency the conclave had not used in 300 years. A frequency that was logged in the old diplomatic contact records, human records, filed alongside their archived communications before the archive had been moved to the extinct category. The voice was calm, clear, speaking conclave standard with an accent that matched no currently living species. "This is Admiral Ren Vasily of the Human Home Fleet. We have received your signal. Please inform the Conclave of Worlds that humanity requests the formal resumption of diplomatic relations. We are aware that our return may be unexpected. We have had a long time to prepare for this conversation. We look forward to it." There was a pause. "We have been traveling for 301 years. We would appreciate a response at your earliest convenience." The transmission ended. The Vethani captain sat in her command chair and looked at the sensor reading showing 4,000 ships in silent formation in the dark. She had trained for first contact scenarios. She had read every protocol. She had done the simulations. None of the simulations had covered this. She sent the recording back to the conclave, flagged it Priority 0, a designation that technically did not exist in the official system. And then she did something she had never done in 14 years of deep space posting. She poured herself a drink before the end of her shift. 3 days later, in her quarters on the conclave's central station, Lyra An received a copy of the recording. It was forwarded by a colleague with a short note attached. "You were researching lost civilizations. You may want to update your file." Lyra listened to the recording twice. Then she looked at the note she had written to herself 3 weeks ago, still sitting on her desk. No evacuation wreckage recovered. She picked up the note and held it. Then she started making calls. She had a feeling the next few months were going to be the most important of her career. She had a feeling the conclave was not ready. She was right on both counts. There is a room at the center of the Arc Solis that no one is allowed to enter without permission. It has no weapons in it, no command consoles, no tactical displays. It is climate-controlled to a precise degree and humidity level that took engineers 40 years to agree on. The walls are lined floor to ceiling with sealed storage units, and inside those units are drives, printed documents, handwritten pages sealed in protective film, photographs, recordings, drawings made by children who are long dead, and letters that were never meant to be read by anyone except the person they were written for. It is called the Central Archive. It holds the complete memory of humanity. Every human on every ship in Home Fleet knows it exists. Most of them have never been inside. They do not need to be. Knowing it is there is enough. Admiral Ren Vasily had been inside exactly 3 times in her life. Once as a child, brought by her father. Once as a young officer, seeking something she could not name and did not find. And once when she was promoted to admiral and the outgoing commander took her there and said nothing, just stood with her in the silence for 10 minutes and then walked out. She understood by the 3rd visit. The archive was not meant to be read. It was meant to be carried. When the confirmation came through that the conclave scout ships had made contact, Ren did not celebrate. She called her senior staff together in the main briefing room of the Arc Solis and told them what had happened in the same flat, factual tone she used for everything. Then she asked them to vote on whether Home Fleet should respond formally or maintain silence and continue on their current course without engagement. The vote was not unanimous. 7 of her 12 senior staff voted to engage, 4 voted to stay silent, 1 abstained. which was Commander Ivo Strand, and he abstained because he wanted to fire on the scout ships and knew that was not actually one of the options being offered. Wren counted the votes. Then she drafted the response herself and sent it personally. She did not hand it to a communications officer. She felt that some things should be done by the person responsible for them. What happened next, nobody planned for. The response got out. Not to the conclave. The conclave received the official transmission, and that was that. But inside Home Fleet, word moved the way it always did on the fleet, fast, informal, and unstoppable. By the time Wren finished drafting a formal address to the fleet population, half of them already knew. The other half found out when their neighbors started knocking on their doors. 11 million people learned simultaneously that the galaxy knew they existed. The reaction was not what anyone expected. There was no cheering. There were no celebrations, no parties, no speeches broadcast across ship-wide channels. There was instead a very particular kind of stillness that settled over the fleet like something pressing down from above. People sat with it. Some went to find family members. Some went to work because they did not know what else to do with large feelings except put them somewhere useful. Some went to the archive request terminals and put in applications to visit, and the queue backed up for the first time in 20 years. Wren gave her address 2 hours after the news spread. She stood in front of a camera in a small room and spoke for 4 minutes. She said that they had been seen. She said that the conclave would need time to respond. She said that Home Fleet would continue on its current heading and that nothing would change in the day-to-day operations of any vessel. She said that what happened next would happen carefully and correctly. She did not say, "We are almost home." She did not say it because she was not sure it was true, and she had a rule about saying things she was not sure of. What she thought about, alone after the address, was the story every child on the fleet knew. It was not a legend because it was documented, every piece of it recorded and stored in the archive. It was the story of the 17 years before the fleet launched. The astronomers had seen it first. The sun was going to die, and it was going to do it violently, and it was going to do it within 20 years. The initial response from Earth's governments had been, by the archival records, deeply human: disbelief, argument, political paralysis, and then eventually, when the numbers could not be argued with anymore, a furious and desperate scramble to do something. What they settled on was a fleet. Not colony ships in the usual sense, one ship here, another there, scattered across whatever worlds were close enough to reach. The decision that was made, argued over for 2 years and eventually passed by a narrow global vote, was that humanity would leave together or not at all. One fleet. Every ship they could build. Every person they could fit. They could not fit everyone. That was the part of the story that people did not talk about in detail, because the archive had the full records and anyone who went looking found numbers that did not get easier to read no matter how many generations removed you were. Billions of people could not be saved. There was not enough time, not enough ships, not enough of anything. The ones who left were chosen by a process that was as fair as a horrifying situation allowed, and no fairer than that. The ones who stayed, some of them stayed voluntarily. That was also in the archive. Letters from people who gave their spots to strangers. Names of engineers who worked until the last day on ships they knew they would not board. Wren had read some of those letters once. She had not gone back. The fleet had launched with 1.2 million people. 300 years later, it held 11 million. 10 generations of humans who had been born on ships, grown up on ships, built their lives in pressurized corridors and artificial sunlight and carefully managed agricultural bays. They had schools. They had courts. They had music and arguments and funerals and weddings. They had a culture that had grown from what the original evacuees brought with them, and had changed in ways those original evacuees would have found strange and probably wonderful. They had one rule that had never changed, one rule that had been voted on in the 40th year of the journey and had never been seriously challenged since. The fleet moved together, every ship. No exceptions. No splinter groups, no scouts that did not come back, no fast ships running ahead. If one ship could not move, the fleet slowed to match it. If one ship went dark, the fleet stopped until it was found. The thought of scattering, of becoming separate, of losing sight of each other in the dark, was the one fear that crossed every generation without fatting. They had been alone out here for 3 centuries. They had learned what alone meant in a way that most civilizations never had to. They were not going to let it happen by choice. Director Amira Solis had served on the Civilian Council for 20 years, and she had spent most of those years managing problems that were, at their root, problems of small spaces and large populations. Supply chain disagreements, school curriculum disputes, the ongoing argument about whether the ARC SOLIS should be allowed to start a third entertainment channel. Normal things, important things. She was good at them. She was less sure she was good at what was happening now. She sat in her office and read the incoming reports from the conclave, filtered through Wren's diplomatic team, and made notes and tried to understand what she was looking at. The conclave was not welcoming humanity back. The conclave was very carefully not saying anything at all yet, which was a specific kind of political behavior that Amira recognized as preparation for something she was not going to like. She wrote in her personal log that night, "We spent 300 years becoming something. Now we have to figure out how to explain what we became to people who did not watch it happen." Then she closed the log and went to find her daughter, who was 7 years old and had heard about the contact at school and wanted to know if they were going to live on a planet now. Amira held her daughter's hand and said she did not know yet. Her daughter thought about this for a moment and then asked if planets had dogs. Amira laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in 3 days. She said yes, planets had dogs, or they used to. She was not sure about now. Her daughter seemed satisfied with this. Amira thought about the archive and the letters and the numbers she had read once and never looked at again. She thought about the people who stayed so that her grandmother's grandmother could be on this ship. She thought about what it meant to carry something for 300 years and finally be close enough to set it down. She did not cry. She was saving that for later when she had more information. Outside the viewport, the stars were the same as they had always been. Ahead, at a distance still measured in years of travel, was the region of space where Sol used to burn. Home fleet kept moving. It always did. The shuttle carrying Lyra On and her conclave security escort left the docking ring at exactly the agreed time. Lyra had specified the time herself, in writing, with a formality that she hoped conveyed to whoever was reading it that she was taking this seriously. The Dreven soldiers assigned to her escort had not asked about the schedule. They had simply appeared at the shuttle bay with their equipment cases and their flat expressions, and positioned themselves in the rear seats without speaking to her. She did not know who had assigned them to her. She had not requested them. The journey to the ARC SOLIS took 40 minutes. Lyra spent most of it reviewing her notes and trying not to look at the security escort in the seats behind her. She was a diplomat. She had been in rooms with difficult people for her entire career. She was not afraid of sick soldiers. She just wished she knew whose soldiers they actually were. The ARC SOLIS was visible on the shuttle's forward camera long before they reached it. At this distance, it looked like a small moon that had decided to be rectangular. It was built in layers, core structure at the center, additions and expansions over the decades wrapped around it like a very deliberate accumulation of need. Lyra had seen the Conclave's largest warships. This was not a warship. It was something the galaxy did not have a good category for. Docking was smooth. The humans who met her at the airlock were professional and pleasant and spoke Conclave standard without an interpreter. They showed her to a receiving room that had chairs scaled to Vethani proportions. Someone had done research, and offered her something to drink that she accepted without asking what it was. It tasted like fermented grain and was warmer than she expected. She decided she liked it. Admiral Wren, Vasily came in without ceremony. She was shorter than Lyra had imagined, and older in the face than her personnel file suggested. The file was 3 years out of date, which felt suddenly relevant. She wore a uniform that was plain and precisely maintained. She sat across the table from Lyra and put her hands flat on the surface and said, "Thank you for coming in person. We appreciate it." The voice was the same one from the transmission. Calm, direct, with that particular accent that Lyra had been listening to for 3 weeks and still could not place against any living reference point. They talked for 2 hours. Lyra presented the conclave's official position. Humanity could apply for Class 3 refugee status, which would grant them settlement rights on unclaimed worlds and access to conclave trade networks, while their prior territorial claims would be held in suspension, pending a full legal review that might take decades. Ren listened to all of it without interrupting. When Lyra finished, Ren said, "That is a generous offer for a group of people the conclave has spent 3 centuries assuming were dead." Lyra said, "I understand how it must sound." Ren said, "I am going to decline it." She said it the way someone might decline a second cup of something they had already had enough of, politely, without drama. She explained, again calmly, again without heat, that humanity was not applying for refugee status because humanity was not a group of refugees. They were a sovereign civilization returning to their region of space after an absence caused by a natural disaster. The appropriate response from the conclave was recognition, not resettlement processing. Lyra said she understood. She said she did not personally have the authority to grant what Ren was describing, but that she would present the position to the conclave in full. Ren nodded. Then she asked if Lyra would like to see the archive. Lyra had read about the archive in the intelligence briefings the conclave had assembled from the scouts' long-range scans. She had seen it described as a record storage facility. Walking into it was something else entirely. It was enormous. It ran the length of 2 full decks of the Ark SOLIS, and every wall was shelving and every shelf was full. The lighting was warm and steady, the kind designed for preservation rather than work. The room smelled of something Lyra could not identify, something organic and dry and faintly sweet. She asked what it was. A young archivist who had joined them told her it was the particular grain they grew in the agricultural bays. The smell got into everything over time. The archivist showed her sections. Personal logs from the original evacuees, thousands of them, audio and written, some dating from the week before launch. Artwork from the first generation born in space. School assignments, medical records, legal proceedings, letters, so many letters. Lyra stopped at one shelf and looked at the sealed document cases, and thought about the fact that every single person represented in this room was dead, and that the people who lived on this fleet had carried all of them through 3 centuries of darkness and had not lost a single file. She asked how complete the records were. The archivist said, "We have never lost a document, we have recovered some, we have repaired some, but nothing has been destroyed or discarded." Lyra looked at the shelves for a moment. Then she said, quietly, more to herself than to anyone, "You are the most complete surviving record of pre-extinction human civilization in existence." The archivist said, "Yes, we know." There was no pride in the way she said it. Just the same flatness as everything else, not coldness, but a deep, settled certainty. These people knew exactly what they had and exactly what it had cost. Back in the receiving room, while Ren was speaking with one of her staff, Lyra's attention drifted to the 6 Dreven soldiers who had positioned themselves near the corridor junction outside the room's entrance. They had been quiet all day, well-behaved. She had almost forgotten about them. She noticed one of them had a small device in his hand that he had not had before. She was still thinking about what that meant when Commander Ivo Strand appeared at her elbow and said, very quietly, "Ambassador, I need to show you something privately." The something was a recording. Strand played it for her on a handheld screen in a side room with the door closed. It was a signal intercept, clean audio, clear timestamps. One of the Dreven escorts had been transmitting home fleet's internal layout data, pulled from sensors built into his equipment case, to an encrypted channel that traced back to a conclave military relay station. Lyra watched the recording. She watched it again. Her face did not change much because she had spent 40 years training her face to behave itself in difficult moments. But inside she felt something sharp and cold that she recognized as genuine anger, which she did not often feel. She said, "How long have they been transmitting?" Strand said, "Since they boarded." She said, "Does the Admiral know?" He said, "She asked me to show you first." Lyra sat with that for a moment. Wren had found out her escort were spies, and her first move had been to tell Lyra rather than act on it. It was the most precise possible signal about what Wren thought of Lyra personally, and about what Wren thought of the Conclave's leadership, and about how Wren intended to handle the difference between the two. Lyra said, "Please have them escorted back to their shuttle." Strand said, "Already arranged. We were waiting for your confirmation." The 6 Dreven soldiers were walked back to the docking bay by a calm and polite human escort team that was not armed, or at least was not visibly armed. No one raised their voice. No one blocked a corridor. The soldiers' equipment cases, the transmitting ones, were handed back to them at the airlock sealed with a security tag that had Strand's authorization code on it. The implication was clear. Home Fleet had copied everything, documented everything, and was giving it back as a gesture of courtesy rather than necessity. The soldiers left, the airlock sealed. That evening, Lyra sat in the guest quarters that had been prepared for her, again, scaled correctly for a Vethani, with the adjusted lighting she needed, and recorded a message for her superiors. She said, "The surveillance attempt failed. Home Fleet detected it within hours. They handled it without incident, without weapons, without any action that could be characterized as aggressive. They then gave me the recordings. I want to be very clear about what that means. They are not asking for our protection. They are not afraid of our response. They are behaving with the confidence of a civilization that has already decided how this ends and is simply waiting for us to catch up." She paused. Outside her viewport, the lights of the fleet stretched in every direction, thousands of ships holding close in the dark. She continued, "I want to be very clear about one other thing. These are not refugees. These are not survivors looking for sympathy. They are a civilization, a complete one. What happens next depends entirely on whether the Conclave is willing to accept that, and I do not think we have as much time to decide as we think we do." She sent the message. Then she sat for a while in the quiet of a ship that held 11 million people and made almost no sound at all, because people who had lived in close quarters for 3 centuries knew how to be careful with noise. It was the most organized place she had ever been. That somehow was the most unsettling part of all. The session was supposed to be private. 40 species, sealed chamber, no press, no observers, no recordings for public distribution. High Arbiter Savdenka had arranged it that way deliberately because a thing done quietly was a thing that could be shaped afterward, and Savdenka had been shaping things quietly for 30 years. He was very good at it. He had the votes counted before the session opened. He had the outcome prepared. He had the language of the resolution drafted and approved by 6 of his closest allies, before most of the chamber even had their seats. What he did not have was control of the room's broadcast systems. That became clear 11 minutes into the session, when a junior communications officer from a species called the Barite, small, nervous, and apparently possessed of strong personal opinions about political transparency, sent a live feed of the entire session to 17 independent news networks simultaneously, and then locked herself in a supply closet. By the time anyone realized what had happened, 4 billion people across conclave space were watching. Inside Home Fleet, the signal was picked up by their long-range communications array and immediately broadcast to every ship. 11 million humans stopped what they were doing and found a screen. The debate in the chamber began the way most conclave debates began, slowly, formally, with a great deal of procedural language that said very little. Savdenka opened with a prepared statement that Lyra An, sitting in the observer gallery, recognized immediately for what it was, a masterwork of framing designed to make a denial look like an act of generosity. He talked about humanity's long absence, about the trauma they must have experienced, about the conclave's duty of care toward civilizations in distress. He talked about integration. The word he used was guided integration, as though humanity were a damaged thing that needed careful handling rather than a sovereign entity that had just parked 4,000 ships in galactic space and asked to be treated as such. He never once said they were not a civilization. He did not need to. Everything he said implied it. Lyra An had 20 minutes to respond. She used 18 of them. She began by reading from the Conclave Charter, the original document, 360 years old, which defined the conditions for sovereign recognition. She went through each condition. She matched each one to documented evidence from home fleet. Population threshold, yes. Functioning governance structure, yes. Demonstrated technological capacity, yes. Cultural continuity, yes. She did it without rushing. She did it without drama. She cited sources and invited any member of the chamber to challenge her citations. Nobody challenged them. Then she read from the conclave's own archived record of humanity's original recognition, 400 years ago. She read the specific language used at the time. She put it next to the language in the current charter and showed that nothing had changed. The criteria were the same. Humanity met the criteria. What had changed was that certain parties found humanity's return inconvenient, and inconvenience was not listed anywhere in the charter as grounds for denial. She finished. She sat down. The chamber was quiet in a way that Savdenka did not like. He moved quickly to his next piece. He called on the director of Conclave Survey Operations, who presented data on the Sol system, the debris field, the mining operations currently running there, the investment made by 3 member species over the past century. He talked about the practical difficulties of unwinding those operations if human territorial rights were restored. He was very careful about numbers, very specific about economic impact. He let the chamber do the math. Several delegates shifted in their seats. The math was not comfortable. Then Director Amara Solis appeared on the chamber's main screen. Nobody had invited her. She had simply sent a signal to the ARC SOLIS communications relay, which had bounced it to the session's broadcast frequency, the same one the Barite officer had opened, and asked politely if she might address the chamber for a moment. Given that 4 billion people were watching, nobody could think of a clean way to refuse. She was a small woman with gray-streaked hair and the calm expression of someone who had spent 20 years managing large problems in small spaces. She thanked the chamber for their time. She said she understood there were economic concerns about the Sol debris field, and she wanted to address them. She then shared the Home Fleet Technical Manifest. Not as a boast, as a document. She walked through it section by section, the energy generation systems developed over 3 centuries of necessity, the food synthesis techniques that had evolved when biological farming was not always possible, the hull materials engineering that had produced armor capable of surviving stresses no planet-based construction would ever need to withstand. She talked about medical systems developed for populations living without planetary resources, about water recovery methods, about atmospheric management at scales the conclave had not attempted. She offered all of it, freely, to any conclave member who wanted to talk. She said, "We are not asking the conclave to give us something. We are asking the conclave to acknowledge something that is already true. We are here. We are a civilization. We have things to offer. We would prefer to offer them as partners, but we are not waiting for permission to exist." She ended the transmission. The chamber sat with that for a moment. The vote was called. The result came back 22 to 18 in favor of full recognition, but the conclave charter required a two-thirds majority, 27 votes, for formal sovereign recognition. The vote failed. Savdenka did not smile because the feed was still live and 4 billion people were watching, but the people who knew him well enough saw the particular stillness in his face that meant he was satisfied. He moved immediately to call the transmission from Director Solis an act of political coercion, and to request emergency powers to regulate home fleet's communications pending a formal review. He was still speaking when every screen in the chamber and every screen watching the broadcast showed the same image. Admiral Ren Vasily, sitting at her command station on the Ark SOLIS. Behind her, through the viewport, the lights of home fleet stretched into the dark. She looked directly into the camera with the expression of someone who had prepared for this exact outcome and found it neither surprising nor particularly threatening. She did not wait to be recognized. She simply spoke. She said, "We have watched today's session. We thank the chamber for the time and for the honest debate. 22 of you voted to acknowledge what has always been true. We remember that and we are grateful for it." She paused. "The vote did not reach threshold. We understand the charter. We are not going to contest the process. What we are going to do is continue on our current heading. We are going to find a place to settle. We are going to build something. The conclave is welcome to participate in that process, to talk to us, to negotiate with us, to establish the terms of a relationship that works for everyone. We would genuinely prefer that. We have no interest in conflict." Another pause, just long enough. "But we are not going to hold position. We have been holding position for 300 years. That is done now." She looked at the camera for one more moment. Then she reached forward and ended the transmission herself. The chamber erupted. Savdenka stood and called it a threat and demanded an immediate response. Several delegates were already on their personal communicators, calling back to their home governments. 3 of the delegates who had voted against recognition were staring at the manifest that was still displayed on their personal screens and not looking at anything else. In the engineering bay of the Ark SOLIS, Chief Engineer Davy watched the vote results finalize on a wall screen. He was a large man who spoke quietly and fixed things, and he had watched the entire session between tasks without saying much to the people around him. When the session ended, he set down his tools and rubbed the back of his neck and thought about the terraforming arrays sitting in storage on 3 of the larger support ships, designed and built and maintained for a century, never yet used. He turned to his shift supervisor and said, "Start pulling the terraforming inventory. Full audit. I want to know what we have and what needs servicing." His supervisor said, "Was that authorized?" Davy said, "My grandfather's grandfather helped build those arrays. They were authorized the day we launched." He picked up his tools. "Get started." Outside, the fleet kept moving. It always did. In the conclave legal offices, there was a woman named Sira who had worked in document processing for 11 years and had never once done anything that could be described as significant. She filed things. She reviewed things. She moved information from one part of the system to another and ensured it arrived in the correct format. She was reliable and thorough and completely invisible, which was why she had access to the kinds of documents that were not meant to be seen by anyone who would do anything with them. She had been doing her job on a normal shift when a set of classified communiques moved through her queue that were not, strictly speaking, supposed to be in the queue she processed. Someone had routed them incorrectly. It happened occasionally. She was supposed to flag the error and forward the files to the correct department without reading them. She read them. Then she sat at her desk for a very long time doing nothing. What she had read was a coordination plan between 3 conclave member species, the same 3 currently operating mining operations in the Sol debris field, to position a combined force of private military contractors ahead of home fleet's projected course. Not conclave military, private. Deniable. The plan used language that was careful about never saying exactly what the contractors were supposed to do if home fleet approached the position. It did not need to say it. The positioning was clear. The timing was clear. The desired outcome was clear. Someone wanted home fleet to fire first, and they had arranged to make that possible. Sierra sat at her desk for a long time. Then she contacted the only person she could think of who might be able to do something with this information, and who would not bury it. She contacted Lyra on. Lyra received the message in the small office she had been assigned as the Conclave's newly appointed liaison to Home Fleet, a position that had been created in a hurry after the broadcast session, as a way of appearing to do something constructive while Savdenka figured out his next move. She read it twice. Then she read it again. Then she opened her diplomatic resignation documents, forms she had prepared 3 weeks ago and not yet submitted, signed them, encrypted them, and sent them to the Conclave Secretary General's office with a 30-minute delay on delivery. Then she sent a personal message to Admiral Ren Vasily. She did not use official channels. She used the direct contact frequency Ren had given her quietly at the end of their first meeting, pressed into her hand on a physical card, the way people did things when they did not want a digital record. The message was short. It named the 3 species involved. It gave the approximate coordinates of the contractor fleet based on the routing data in the communiques. It said, "I am sorry. I did not know. I am no longer in a position where I can pretend otherwise." She sent it. Then she waited for the Conclave to notice she had resigned. Aboard the Ark SOLIS, Ren read Lyra's message alone. Then she called Ivo Strand. Strand had been waiting for something like this since the beginning. He was 34 years old and had grown up on one of the smaller Ark ships in a community of about 20,000 people, and he had spent his entire career training for a fight that never came. Every generation of home fleet military personnel trained for it. Defense protocols, combat formations, weapons maintenance, threat response. They all trained for it, and none of them, in 300 years, had ever needed to use any of it in a real engagement. When Ren told him about the contractor fleet, Strand did what he had always done in crisis scenarios. He started laying out options. Intercept and engage. Divert around the position with enough speed to make pursuit impractical. Hold position and send a warning. Ren listened to all of it. Then she said, "What do they want us to do?" Strand went quiet. She said it again, more slowly. "What is the outcome they are hopping for? What is the thing that, if it happens, makes all of this work the way they planned?" Strand said, "They want us to fire first." Ren said, "Yes." Strand looked at his tactical display for a moment. The contractor fleet was sitting right on the most efficient route through the transit corridor. Going around meant losing weeks. Going through meant walking into a prepared position. Either way, the contractors were in control of the geometry. Unless home fleet changed what the geometry was measuring. He said slowly, "If we pass through at an angle that puts 3 conclave border stations inside our sensor range, and then any incident gets recorded on official conclave equipment. Automatically, without anyone's permission." Ren said yes. Strand said, "The contractors stand down because getting caught conducting an unauthorized military operation in conclave sensor range is a much bigger problem than whatever they were paid to start." Ren said, "That is my read." Strand looked at her. He said, "That is not a combat solution." She said, "No." He said, "It is the correct one." She said, "Yes." The course adjustment went out to the fleet within the hour. From the outside, it looked like a routine navigation change, a slight angle shift that added minimal time to the journey. From inside the geometry of the situation, it repositioned home fleet as a witness to its own potential ambush. The contractor fleet, sitting in their prepared position and watching the sensor returns as home fleet changed course, found themselves suddenly visible on 3 sets of official conclave border station sensors that were recording everything in real time. They held position for 4 hours. Then quietly they began to disperse. No shots were fired. No communications were exchanged. No one needed to announce what had happened, because what had happened was that one side had threatened violence and the other side had responded by making the threat impossible to execute without official documentation of who started it. That was the end of that. Inside Home Fleet, word of the contractor fleet never fully reached the civilian population. Wren's staff kept it contained, not out of a desire to hide things, but because there was a significant vote happening, and she did not want the vote influenced by fear. The settlement vote was the largest democratic exercise in Home Fleet history. Every person over the age of 16 was eligible. The question had been debated for decades in various forms, but this was the first time it was formally put to the entire population with binding weight. Where should Home Fleet settle? Wren and the Council had put 3 options on the ballot. The Sol debris field region, an unclaimed cluster farther from conclave space, a contested zone closer to existing conclave territory, staking a claim under prior rights. The debate that preceded the vote was not organized. It happened everywhere at once, in the way that decisions happened on the fleet, in corridors, in cafeterias, in the large common spaces of the ARC ships where people gathered when something mattered. It was not always polite. People had strong feelings and 3 centuries of built-up opinions about what home should mean. An older man on the ARC KELLIS, who had spent 40 years as a life support engineer, voted for Sol without hesitation. He said his grandmother had told him what sunlight felt like on bare skin, real sunlight, from a real star, and that even if Sol was gone, being near where it used to be was as close as they could get to the thing she had described. A young woman who taught history on the Ark Dawn voted for the unclaimed cluster. She said Sol was a memory, and memories were important, but you could not live in a memory, and that building something new somewhere new was more honest about who they actually were now than trying to go back. A teenager in one of the school common rooms asked a teacher why they could not just stay on the ships. The teacher played archival footage of a forest, old footage, the colors a little faded, the sound slightly compressed by the recording process. The children watched leaves moving in wind that none of them had ever felt. Several of them cried without knowing why. The teenager who had asked the question did not cry. She watched the footage and then quietly changed her mind about ships. The vote came back at 61% for the Sol debris field region, not to rebuild what had been lost, not to try to reclaim the exact territory, to settle near the place that used to be home, to build something new in view of something old. Wren received the result in her quarters late at night, after most of the fleet had gone to sleep. She read the numbers. She sat with them. Then she opened the drawer of her desk and took out something she kept there and had never displayed, a small photograph, printed on actual paper, sealed in protective film. It was a picture of Earth taken from orbit, decades before the end. Blue and white and green and impossibly beautiful. She had never seen it with her own eyes. She had been born on a ship, so had her parents, so had their parents. She looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she put it back in the drawer and went to inform the navigation team of the fleet's final destination. Outside every viewport on every ship, the stars were the same as they had always been. But one region of them, far ahead, looked slightly different now. It looked like somewhere they were going. The first thing they noticed was the wind. Not the recycled, managed, precisely calibrated airflow of the ships. They had all lived with that their entire lives, and most of them did not think of it as wind at all. This was something different. The survey team that went down to the surface of the larger of the 2 worlds stood in a shallow rocky valley under a pale greenish-gray sky, and the wind came across the ridge and hit them, and 3 of them stopped walking mid-step and just stood there. It smelled of rock and something cold, and something else that had no name in the vocabulary any of them had grown up with because it was the smell of an atmosphere that had been making itself without any help for 4 billion years. It was not pleasant exactly. It was not unpleasant. It was just completely, overwhelmingly real in a way that the inside of any ship never was, no matter how large the ship or how good the air management. The team lead, a woman named Dr. Pella who had been in geological survey for 20 years, eventually remembered that they were supposed to be taking readings. She started giving instructions. Two of her team members had to blink a few times first before they could focus on their equipment. Nobody mentioned this afterward, but nobody forgot it either. The planet was not beautiful. It was cold. The sky was wrong by the standards of every archived photograph they had grown up with. The ground was hard and dark and covered with small flat rocks that shifted when you stepped on them. The nearest thing to vegetation was a low gray-green ground cover that clung to the sheltered sides of the larger rocks and did not appear to do much else. There were no trees. There were no bodies of water visible from the survey site. Chief Engineer Davy, monitoring the survey feed from the ARC SOLIS, said it was perfect. His junior staff looked at him. He said, "Flat rock is easy to build on. Cold means the thermal equations work in our favor. Gray-green ground cover means there is something here that figured out how to survive, which means the atmosphere is viable and the soil has biological activity." He looked at the feed. "We have been building in harder conditions for 3 centuries. This is easy." He pulled up the terraforming inventory, which his team had spent the past month auditing and servicing, and started assigning project leads. The Conclave news feed, which Home Fleet had been monitoring throughout, reported the landing with a mix of responses that ranged from cautious welcome to poorly disguised alarm. 3 of the species whose mining operations were in the Sol debris field issued formal statements welcoming humanity's settlement of the new system and expressing hope for productive future relations, which was a very smooth way of saying they were relieved that humanity had settled somewhere other than their mining operations, and they hoped the matter was now closed. Savdenka did not issue a statement. He was not in a position to issue statements. The documentation of the contractor fleet, all of it, Sierra's intercepted communiques, Home Fleet's sensor logs showing the contractor's positions, the Conclave border station's automatic recordings, had reached every independent news outlet in the Conclave within a week of the failed ambush. Sierra had sent it from the supply closet she had locked herself into, using a personal device and an encrypted relay she had set up 3 days before she read the communiques, because she was the kind of person who made decisions quickly and then prepared carefully. She had not expected to keep her job. She had not kept her job. She had instead been offered a position as a material witness in a formal conclave inquiry, which was not a job but was at least something that would last a while. The 3 species whose private contractors had been caught in documented position for an unauthorized military operation in conclave sensor range were spending their political energy on damage limitation and had no capacity to cause anyone else problems for the foreseeable future. Savdenka resigned on a Tuesday. He gave a statement about the stress of public service and the importance of fresh leadership. It was carried live on 4 networks, and nobody believed a word of it, and he was out of political life within the month. Under new interim leadership, the conclave moved quickly for the conclave, which meant within 3 months rather than 3 years, to pass a provisional recognition of humanity as a sovereign civilization. It was not full membership. The language was careful and hedged and surrounded by conditions and review periods, but it was real. It was in writing. It was signed by 31 of the 40 member species. Director Amara Solis received it on behalf of Home Fleet in a formal transmission, sitting at her desk on the ARC SOLIS in her best official clothes, with the central archive 2 decks below her and 11 million people around her. She thanked the conclave for their recognition. She said that humanity looked forward to a productive relationship. She said that Home Fleet accepted the terms with the understanding that the provisional conditions would be addressed in good faith over the coming years. Then, when the official transmission ended and before she called the next meeting, she took the full text of the recognition document and walked it down to the archive herself, and handed it to the head archivist, and watched while it was logged and filed and sealed in its protective case and placed on its shelf. She said nothing while she watched this happen. The archivist asked if she wanted a receipt. She said no. Then she went back to her office. 3 weeks after the provisional recognition was signed, Lyra An received a package at the temporary housing unit she was staying in while she figured out what to do with the rest of her career. The package was a sealed envelope. Inside was a single document, 1 page, printed on actual paper, which was unusual. It was signed by both Admiral Ren Vasily and Director Amara Solis, and it granted Lyra an honorary citizenship of the human home fleet, citing her service to the cause of honest diplomacy and her demonstrated willingness to choose what was right over what was easy. Lyra read it twice. She was alone. She sat very still for a moment. Then she set the document down carefully on the table in front of her, smoothed it flat with both hands, and looked at it for a while. She had been a diplomat for 40 years. She had received awards and commendations from 7 different governing bodies. She had never received anything that made her feel quite like this. She did not cry. She had 4 eyes and very precise control of her tear ducts, which she had always considered an advantage in her profession. She cried a little. Ivo Strand applied for the first planetary settlement lottery 3 days after it opened, which was still not as fast as some people, because some people had applied within 20 minutes of the lottery going live at what was technically 2 in the morning on their ship's schedule. He was selected in the second round. He was assigned a plot of land in the first settlement zone, a flat area near a ridge, close to the initial landing site, with the same shifting rocks underfoot and the same cold wind. He tried to build a house. He was a tactical officer and a capable soldier, and he understood spatial geometry and structural stress tolerances at a theoretical level, which turned out to be not quite the same thing as building a house. The result leaned slightly to the left and had a door that required a specific technique to open properly, and a roof section that made a sound in high wind that he eventually decided to describe as character rather than defect. He was prouder of it than he had been of anything in his life. He sent a photograph to Ren. She sent back a single line, "It looks like you made it yourself." He could not tell if this was a compliment. He decided it was. 10 years passed. The way that time passes when things are being built, not smoothly, not without difficulty, but constantly accumulating. 1 problem solved and 3 more discovered, and those 3 solved and 5 more found. The ongoing forward motion of people who had nowhere to be but here and nothing to do but make it work. The settlement had grown into a small city. It had a name, Vila. Someone had proposed it at a community meeting and it had stuck without much debate, which was how the best names usually happened. The sky was still pale greenish-gray. The ground was still cold and rocky. There were trees now. In the sheltered areas where the terraforming work had made the soil deep enough, small and young, and nothing like the forest in the archived footage, but real, alive, moving in the wind. The first generation of children born on the surface, not ship-born, not ark-born, but ground-born, a word they were already using to distinguish themselves with the complete seriousness of children who feel the distinction is very important, ran outside one morning because it was morning and they did not need a reason. Someone had left a door open. 6 of them between the ages of 4 and 9 ran through it without coats because they had not yet learned the habit of checking what the outside was doing before going into it. The wind hit them. They stopped, all 6 of them in a ragged line just outside the door, blinking, the cold, the smell, the sky pressing down on them with nothing between them and it. One of the younger ones looked like she might retreat back inside. Then the oldest one laughed, surprised by it, not performing it, just laughing, and ran forward, and the others followed, and they ran until they were out of sight past the ridge and the adults inside could only hear them, distant and getting further. Ren Vasily was sitting on the hill outside the city when this happened. She did not see the children run. She heard them later briefly before they got too far away. She was holding a cup of coffee that had been grown in actual soil, not synthesized, not reclaimed but grown from beans, in a small agricultural plot 3 kilometers from where she was sitting, which was still new enough to seem extraordinary, and she was looking at the sky. The local sun was setting. It was not yellow. It was a pale orange, slightly redder than Earth's sun, which she had never seen and knew only from photographs. The stars were beginning to appear. She found one. It was not bright. It was a faint smear of light in a particular direction that she knew from 40 years of looking at star charts was where the Sol system used to be. Not where it was gone. Its light and mass collapsed and scattered 3 centuries ago. But the direction was the same. The coordinates still pointed at the place where it had been. She looked at it the way you look at a photograph of someone who is gone, who shaped you completely, who you carry with you all the time without thinking about it until a quiet moment makes you stop and remember. She was not sad. She did not look at it with grief, or at least not mostly with grief. She looked at it the way you look at something that matters with the full attention it deserves, because not looking carefully would be its own kind of loss. The coffee was still warm. The wind was doing the thing it always did, and she still did not have a word for the smell of it. The city behind her was making the sound cities make when they do not realize they are being listened to. Below the city, at the edge of the first settlement zone, the lights of Home Fleet were just becoming visible in the darkening sky, 4,000 ships in their familiar formation, still holding close, the way they always had. They were in orbit now rather than deep space. The formation had adjusted to match the planet's curve, but they were still together. They were always together. That was not going to change. Far away, on a conclave data server that was updated automatically and without ceremony, a database entry was revised for the first time in 300 years. The entry read, Human Civilization Class, Active. Origin, Sol System destroyed. Current territory, New Sol Compact established 2847, Vila Settlement and associated fleet infrastructure. Status, Sovereign, provisional recognition pending full review. Notes, see full historical record. Do not mark as lost.